Okay, yeah, but it doesn't overcome sleep deprivation, if you know what I mean. Uh, Worm. So, we're talking about someone who intentionally sleeps and then gets back up, kind of thing. Taking a break from something continuous can be very stressful, but it also has to be a reasonable amount of a lack of sleep deprivation. So it sounds like you're a lot tired or like a lot more exhausted than anything. But it's a very effective strategy. So like if you know how long something will take, say something takes 4 hours, right? And through your own experience, if you have to do a 4-hour task and you have experienced that your attention waves at maybe an hour or two. So after an hour, you take like a 15-minute pause, get a snack, something that breaks the tedium to some extent, then come back to it. That 15-minute investment it can dramatically boost the efficiency of not having that 15 minutes in the first place. So like if you continue for a minute, an hour, like to 2 hours, you can probably achieve something far greater naturally most of the time in an hour and 45 minutes with a break in between. But it comes down to experience. So I was just making an observation about something that's practiced. It's a thing that people practice to do. So it becomes more and more efficient over time. It's a really reliable strategy if you have an assignment that takes a long time. And you can do them, you can become super efficient at it. Like what I mean by this is, for example, during work, I don't know, I'm in a lab meeting and it takes 3 hours. Like the meeting was going really long. It's just usually meetings are an hour long. But even in lab meetings, actually, one of the practices in the lab that I used to work with, we take breaks. If it goes beyond 1 hour, we take a 15-minute break. We literally stop the lab meeting and then come back. But if it keeps going, like you're in a situation where you can't have breaks, a breathing exercise for 15 seconds, the amount of 15 seconds that you miss, like even during the thing, you catch up really rapidly. So being able to reset yourself even 15 to 30 seconds is pretty reliable once you get into the habit. I do that quite a lot. Um, that's how I study all night or cram for things, so to speak. But I don't want to be, it doesn't, I don't want to give you the impression that it's confusing with those people who like study for 8 hours straight. When I cram for something, I do it over the period of 8 hours, but it's not without breaks. Because I know how long I can do something, and I would put it at about an hour. However, it would seem like I'm doing it for a really long time. Like for me, like when I'm streaming, right? Uh, it would go for 8 hours, but a lot of people would come in and say, "Man, this guy's been streaming for 6 to 8 hours." I'm actually taking breaks, like mentally, in my head right now. It might not seem that way, but I'm resetting every time I'm doing something. So, like, we just finished side stories here. I'm resetting right now as we speak. It's not a literal resting. I'm just breaking it up, doing something else. I mean, this game naturally helps with that because you have so many different tasks, right? So even breaking up a task with a different task helps quite a bit. And if you get used to it, you become really good at juggling tasks. So when people say, "Oh yeah, you're really good at multitasking," I'm not really multitasking the way people would think. Basically, you're keeping all that stuff in your head, right? You got to remember task A, you got to remember task B. What I'm doing when I'm multitasking is I'm focusing on A, and then I'm going to drop A for a moment and focus on task B. And then I'm going back to A. So eventually, you get in the habit of understanding how really the mind works. The mind is not trying to keep both the thoughts in at the same time. It's being efficient when you're switching to a task. So when I'm looking at chat and I'm playing a game, I'm working on dividing my attention when I require it. Because there's no real true multitasking. You're not reading and comprehending chat at the exact same time you're doing something else. If it overlaps, you're actually just switching back and forth really quickly. But there's a difference between switching back and forth and getting like 20% because you keep switching back and forth without being efficient with that time. It requires practice. So you learn the separate skills, but you're breaking up that task. So it doesn't feel like 8 hours to me because I'm juggling other things. It's 8 hours of not a singular task. Yeah, the thing I say, I don't use numbers because you have to fill it out yourself, right? It's the person that knows the most is yourself over time. You'll probably have realized at some point, say you go to school. School is usually the first place you learn, but then you go on a job. You'll kind of learn where your productivity kind of declines, but it's not because your productivity declines because you're not dedicated or you're not emotional or like you're not hardworking. It naturally declines. It's like a bell curve. It's to understand how the human condition works. Your mind works that way. It and finding that way out, you can bounce back. You can utilize what you're understanding. Like you're losing attention. It's not because you're lazy. Like a lot of times people would ascribe it to, oh, you're just lazy or you don't work hard enough. You can be as efficient as the next person by working in smaller duration over a longer period of time by understanding your own endurance, your own tolerance. So like for example, if I worked 4 hours straight, I'm going to get less work done than working in 45 periods 4 times, 45-minute periods across the 4 hours. Some people can work an hour and a half, so 2 hour-and-a-half periods with a 30-minute break in between. The idea is it's not just because of your own stigma. Like a lot of people think procrastination and like laziness and stuff is the result of people's lack of willpower or sentimentalism or vigilance. But a lot of times it comes down to really understanding why you become bored or why you lose attention, why your productivity. And in the end, it might actually be the reason why you are lazy or you do procrastinate. But that procrastination then has a different perspective on it now. You procrastinate because you've been working against yourself. Like procrastination happens when people keep visualizing their task as one gigantic block. So like, I got to do my homework. If I start my homework, I got to finish it. If I don't finish it, well, I'm just going to procrastinate until I have to finish all of it at once. Well, you'd be surprised if a teacher like myself, I consider myself an internal teacher. If I see a person that has a procrastination tendency, I would design the homework to complement, to remove that tendency to procrastinate. So I would try to ask the student, like, how long do you think you pay attention to? All right, well, unbeknownst to you, like I won't explain it to the person. I would divide the assignment into that much time. So like if the person says, I get bored of doing homework after 15 minutes. It's like, well, what if I gave you 10, 15-minute assignments as opposed to one 150-minute assignment? Like, so you switch up the perspective on the person. that person doesn't have to, like, you could just sit down and explain to them, you can do this, you can try this and see if it works. But as a kid, right, like when you're teaching someone younger who has less discipline and less tools yet from living experience, it's it sounds a little egotistical, but it is really up to the responsibility of the person who is older and more experienced to try to get them to intuit it, to, instead of worrying about all the, like, the details. And that's what I was kind of trying to say, that in the long run this becomes a lot easier. Like, I no longer, whenever someone says I'm cramming, when I was in college, like people would say, "Oh yeah, you study every day to get the material." It's like, well, I kind of still cram, and it's kind of considered procrastination, but really, it's more like doing small bits but condensed together. So, with that practice, I knew how much time I need, and because I know how much time I need accurately or get more accurately, I can subdivide it anywhere I want. So some days I'll cram for an exam. Some days I'll take it in small chunks through like a whole month's period. If I have a project that takes 3 months worth of time, I can choose when to subdivide the 3 months worth of time so that no matter what, I reach the deadline. And I do this because I keep myself on my toes. Like, I don't actually do the same thing every single time. So sometimes I have to cram because, you know, when you're on a job, right, or at school and stuff, you don't get to choose usually how deadlines come up, how like mishaps and schedule changes and stuff. So the more flexible you become, generally speaking, the higher chance you're happy with your performances. Because passive challenges like due dates and deadlines, you don't get to choose their condition. But what you can get to choose is how flexible you are. So then in the future, it's like, I'll get it done. Like, well, when someone's like, are you sure? It's like, yeah, I'll get it done. It's like, but it's different from what you're doing. It's like, what do you think I do normally? I like to think that I don't give you the impression that I always do the same thing every single day. Like, what I mean is my approach is the same every single day. That would mean that I'm very good at that one thing, you know, the same approach, but I like to be okay and generally good at a lot of things. Then you always get that feeling when someone asks you something, or maybe give you an assignment, or you lost some sleep, your schedule is a little out of whack, things, you feel like you're up to the task, like you can handle it. So the feeling thing about the chunk, like the focus, you're trying to get a gauge of where that is, where when it becomes not boring, you're still focused, it provides good feedback, and you're not trying to like work your schedule around for a one-off to accommodate it. But that's the amount of period that you're focusing on, and that's the goal. I don't know what that is, but with a lot of practice, it feels great. It's almost like a game. How long can you focus? And you can treat it like a physical event. So like you had to run 10 minutes straight, right? Tomorrow you can try to increase your focus. Run 11 minutes straight. It's like the analogy. Or you can change it to distance. And then distance becomes another metric. So instead of saying, "Oh, I can run 10 minutes straight," how about how far I run in those 10 minutes? So you can swap up your attention too. So how long do you want your sustained attention? But how does that correlate with your mood? And how much are you retaining? So the hot take here is sometimes being dedicated and fighting it out, like doing the endurance run, you might not be getting as much in terms of mental return. So when someone studies 4 hours and you know after 2 hours they're not getting anything new, they could have been sleeping for those 2 hours. They could have been playing video games, doing something that gives them more positive energy, and then coming back to it. So that's kind of how I view obstacles, especially boredom. Boredom, loss of focus, it's really your body telling you that perhaps there's something else that are, if there's anything worth saying, it's a better use of your time overall. But you still have to get tasks done. So I understand the pressure for being forced to feel like you must complete the task at once. But breaking it up is really, really helpful. In fact, I highly recommend it. I think the internet does give you that impression that people get things done together really fast, like all at once. It just feels like everything gets done really quickly. But a little at a time makes all the big things smaller. It's one the hot take in this is we'll like give it like a digression, right? We'll full send this digression a little at a time. When you have a big task, it doesn't matter like, and if you're asking me what is considered big, it's like, no, you're big. So whatever you consider as a big task, in which you have to bend over backwards, as in sacrifice your emotional stability and compromise your emotions to do, be it your health or your mental health, the idea is to evaluate it and see if you can break it into smaller pieces. And when you break it into smaller pieces, it does a lot of things like making it less overwhelming, make it more manageable, and it probably compartmentalize. It works to the advantage of the person, ability to compartmentalize. So one of the biggest strategies when it comes to the most consistent strategies, I'm not going to say it's 100% successful or not. It reduces micromanaging, and what it does is the daunting task of like 100 billion things become 100 small things, and you can now do small things. You can accomplish those smaller things more than the whole thing as a whole. So to give you an example, to tie it back to streaming, especially when someone greets me, say a random person is going to come in now, just now, hops in and say, man, you've been streaming for 5 hours. It's like, well, I don't see myself doing one task for 5+ hours. But when someone comes in and tells me, man, how can you been doing this for 5.5 hours? Their perspective is that they think I'm doing the same thing for 5.5 hours. As in, that's more of a compliment, or maybe they're making a comment about something else. But generally, it's like, wow, way to go, dude. You did 5, and it's like, I don't see it as doing the same task for 5.5 hours. That's what keeps me energetic, or not bored, or losing focus. You have to understand your focus threshold and juggle tasks within that threshold. There are streamers that intuit this. A streamer would take literal time breaks. The whole like get up and stretch thing, that's another way. You know, you break your tedium temporarily and then come back. But instead of doing that, I take it in another step. I focus on different tasks that I'm working on during streaming while doing that one task. And for this game, it's usually how I read. So like, there are points that I want to learn how to read, and I'm focusing on different things. So like, for 30 minutes, I'm focusing on trying to get a meaning or a deep cut in something. And then the next 30 minutes, I'm going to focus on my, like, how my voice is doing and how I'm working on that. And then the next, all the while focusing on the primary task, which is to play the game. But the idea is now that if you look back on any of my streams, my task is snapping to different emphasis while I'm streaming. I don't see it as one thing. Like, I'm not doing it as one thing. I'm focusing on several things and I'm going back and forth to keep it fresh. So when you're playing a game, yeah, like when you're playing a game like FromSoft, a Souls game, you're gonna focus on beating this boss, and yeah, you do it in 6 hours straight. Like if you're that guy who like love that diminished return and go 6 hours straight and do it. For me, if I did 6 hours straight, I would probably spend more time than if I just played 30 minutes on separate occasions. If I play 30 minutes, stop. Play 30 minutes, I'll probably finish in like an hour and a half. Even better, I'll sleep in between. 30 minutes, sleep the next day, come back and do the 30 minutes, and I'll probably do it. As opposed to going 6 hours straight and probably not accomplishing it the first time. And immediately coming back, it'll take like 10 minutes. Because all 60 minutes, you have not consolidated that learning experience. And that goes with the pattern of taking breaks and absorbing the thing. But it can be temporary. You can still do it. You still can gather that benefit if you don't have time to sleep, right? So for me, what I would do is like the mini game, this side story for the baseball thing. I saw the pitch. It was faster. In that 10-second window, I told myself, all right, clear my mind. I just absorbed it. And now I do it again. It's not forcing myself to take all of it constantly. I'm pausing between my learning experiences to consolidate, since I don't have time to sleep on it. But if it's a gigantic task like an essay or a project, I know when my focus is going to go off, and it just isn't as efficient as just elevating your emotions again and like taking a break, eating, coming up with stuff, and then working. What that pays off in the end is that when you're doing stuff, when you're being productive, you're maximizing your productiveness. There's no like inconsistency in the quality of its work too. So with enough practice, you're constantly working within your like 70 to 90% quality rate. So over time, your quality is going to go up consistently. So you don't have things like, hey, I stream. I'm going to use content creation as an example since I do it most of the time. There isn't a dip in my consistency in getting online and reading dialogue and stuff. When I know that I am not able to, I just won't. And I'm always keeping that in mind. So over time, you don't even bother. It's not even laborious. You don't even have to schedule things. You just fill it out after a while. Usually though, for myself, I like to like do it, plan it out first, then fill it out, because I'm not a very intuitive person. However, for other people, the idea is to fill it out and then start planning. Like you have to understand how you approach more often. I like seeing the thing before starting to rely on intuition. But I would say for these things, a larger majority of people would fill it out and then start writing it down. Like the goal is you fill it out, and I challenge the person and say, can you explain what you filled out? Like how you fill out your, how did you come to 2 hours? How do you know your, can you describe when you lose focus in that 1 hour? So you start writing the stuff down. I just tend to do it in the reverse. I like to write the things out and confirm it if my feelings are aligning. But either or will get you to like, or a mix of both with different things will get you to the goal. The general concept is that you have to figure out when you're getting diminished returns. And usually when it comes to focus, it's not because you're like inept. I really dislike the idea of when people say, "Oh, I lose focus very easily. Therefore, I'm a papega." Like they just write themselves out. It's like, well, all right. When do you lose focus? How do you stay on focus? You've so if you know you lost focus, that means you were focused at some point, right? That's a different question entirely, but sometimes people might not notice that they lose focus or was focusing before. That's like a really tough thing too. But say you take their word for it, like they're losing focus, right? You have to ask them, so how long did you stay focused? Did you know? So once you start thinking about that, it's like, well, you lose focus after 15 minutes. Okay, well, 15 minutes on, I don't know, 1 minute off. 15 minutes on, 1 minute off. Doesn't that produce the same 15-minute, like that's 30-minute focus with two 1 minute breaks? That's far more efficient than going 1 hour and only paying attention for 15 minutes. Like that's 45 minutes of break time that you just threw out. In fact, 15 minutes and taking a 45-minute break is still more conducive to someone's health and mental health than going 1 hour and feeling miserable 45 minutes. Sometimes it's difficult to answer because the effective attention span feels different depending on how you evaluate the task emotionally. So intuitively, it could vary. That's why it's complicated. But that in itself is why there's no like a fixed thing, right? It's diligence. The idea is though, you know how to characterize when you lose effective attention, not depending on how long the thing is, like, or what it is, or anything. It will vary. The time and place will vary. But the idea is you're trying to discern the characteristics that are consistent between them. That's how you get maximizing approaches. Like, that's how one skill can produce more return on investment. So instead of focusing on how it varies and it differs, you focus on what is similar. It's kind of ironic that I'm using the word focus, but the idea is you keep looking for differences. You're looking for excuses. You're constantly viewing things on how they may vary, as in, this is the phrase that I've said before, selfishly conscientious. You're focusing on how everything differs, which may make you sound compassionate and considerate and intellectual, but it actually prevents you from answering and looking at patterns. Like, it's too much of one thing. So for example, I'm around intellectuals quite a lot. So when we talk, it's like, okay, I'm going to say a statement like A is true because B is true. And then someone would say, well, technically it depends, because if Z and Y and X are variable and like, and then you have to get like pi and phi and gamma, then I forgot what I was trying to say. It's like, well, yeah, of course you did. And you really derailed then in the intent of the statement. That's an extreme case, but you can see how it normalizes people's personalities. So the goal of what I'm trying to say is trying to form consistency. But how can one perform consistency if their perspective is constantly focused on what is inconsistent? It'd be very difficult. So what that turns out to be to someone like myself is invariably you have cognitive dissonance. You are constantly looking for inconsistencies to invalidate an approach. So one thing I could say is it's close to nihilism. So I can give an example for how to approach this game, right? This game, I could spend the entire time not playing this game because I know that this game has so many things that the experience would variable for everyone. So if I had to review this game, I would come up with it depends. But I didn't. What I did was I chose my conditions on which I evaluate them to the best of my ability. So I pick as many conditions as I can in order to come up with a consistent interpretation. So when you're thinking about your focus and your attention span, you're studying your focus and your attention span with as many conditions as possible in which it restricts how applicable it is. So like it'll probably say like it'll probably restrict you to schoolwork or something. I don't know. Like schoolwork, writing, and maybe job related writing. So yes, the conditions will restrict what you're learning, but what you're doing is you're developing a skill that at least applies to more than one situation, and you're actively doing it. So for me, when I'm reviewing a game, my first thing is target audience. That's my restriction. Target audience. So what, to the best of my ability, how can I collect enough converging evidence to demonstrate that this is the target audience? Not how I feel, not how the random hipster feels, not about people who haven't played this game per se or not interested in this game. The specific target audience from the perspective of the devs and the publisher. So when you inform yourself of that, it is accurate as you can be, as opposed to saying, well, technically I don't know this, and technically I don't want to summarize this because there's too many independents. Like, well, you choose. You get to choose the conditions. And for attention span, you get to choose your metrics. How do you measure when your attention span drops? We'll start with something. And then you're going to say, well, it depends. It's like, well, yeah, the metric is going to vary, but you have to choose what you're focusing on. So for me, a guide of my attention is I have manic thoughts. So when I do a task and I have a thought that is outside, like something like I'm trying to write a sentence, right? And say I need to talk about baseball. Well, I start talking about pitches, and then I thought to myself, man, I really don't know the name a lot of these pitches. Well, I can't do the task anymore. So now I have to do something else. So I have to figure out all the pitches that I want to know. It still feels like it's relevant to what I'm doing, but it's actually distracting me from actually writing. So how often that happens? If it happens too frequently, then I'm losing my attention span. As in, I'm not staying focused on the task. So if I keep worrying about pitches when I'm still writing about baseball in general, that's a problem. That's going to deviate. So I'm measuring those things. But you have to choose what you're measuring. And it happens, and that I need to figure out how often does that involve my other tasks. Like how relevant is that to my other tasks? Like if I'm trying to play a mini game, well, I can tell you it's very clear when I lose focus. Because the moment I have a thought, like especially the baseball games, like the combo games, the moment I have a thought, it only takes like 5 or 6 seconds before I like dramatically drop in performance. So like in this game, we needed to hit 5 homers in back to back. The first 3 pitches of this particular thing, they all went below. Like they all went below the strike zone, like the middle of the strike zone, and immediately my thought was, wait, are they all low? And I missed the next 2. Immediately. It was gone. My focus was gone and I missed the next 2. And then I said it. I was like, oh yeah, I was wondering if it was low, and it went up. Then I resumed focus again. So I addressed how I could clear my mind. And to clear my mind in this case is to say what I was thinking. So I missed the last two is because my first thought was, I wonder if it's gonna go low. And the moment it went high, I missed. Because I was wondering. That's how sharp it is for me. But it might not be as sharp for other people. But instead of worrying about it, you have to get things done. So starting somewhere is great. Constantly saying that it's going to vary back and forth and whatnot is ultimately going to be an excuse to stop from starting in the first place. And that's tough. That's like that initial barrier of things. So, ironically, the thing I said about taking a really big task and then reducing it to, like, say you have a big task that's worth 100 thoughts. How many thoughts can you handle? Let's say 10 thoughts. You break that 100 thoughts into 10 sets of 10 thoughts. And now the 10 thoughts seem achievable. So you tackle all the 10 different sets of thoughts. What you did there with that statement about it's difficult to answer because your effective attention spans different depending on how you evaluate the task, how you intuit certain things, the time of day, your mood, your sleep deprivation. That's the big thing. You have lumped the task of what I suggested as many things as you can collectively do. So prioritize them into small bits that you can do. So let's start with, depending on how you evaluate the task emotionally, maybe that specific thing has 20 core principles that you want to keep intact, and it's still overwhelming. You're saying, nah, this is too variable, it's too difficult. Then you break that down into, well, how I feel on a 0 to 10 scale, for example. If that's still not enough, break it down to maybe just schoolwork. And then you can build up from there. So the idea is, unfortunately, if you are trying to be an intellectual, I guess, I'll use that word. Basically, an intellectual is a state of being, in my opinion, a state of being where you're taking in so much. Like, you want to be considerate of everything. Like, what if I did the wrong thing? What if I need to do a lot of research before I start, right? That's the intellectual, the safe bet, the non-doing, the theoretical work. And that's great. That's the one pillar of someone's abilities. That's the pillar. Like, it's actually overemphasized. Now, the idea is you have to also do the thing. So now you have to be a doer, and that's what the go-getter thing is. When you go get something, you're not burdened by everything that could and would happen or maybe happen. You're focused on the things you know now as opposed to the variability that can introduce. I mean, you could stay in the conceptual phase forever. That's kind of what happens with intellectuals, especially, even worse, a younger generation who has the swarm of the internet, like all that information. Well, here's the thing. It's great to be a know-it-all if you can. It's not healthy to be one. It's manageable and sustainable to be a mix of, you know what you really want to know, ironically, to some extent, and just know that you won't know a lot of things. Like, be acceptant that you're doing something and it might not be the best way to do it. The idea is you need to get into a state that you can start doing it instead of never doing it. And to me, that's why I'm using the word excuse. Excuse is more like nihilism from my perspective. Basically, there's too much technicality that it's so complicated that I'm just gonna wing it. It's just intuitive. Let's just do what I already know how to do, and that's fair. Regrettably, that's not gonna improve anymore. Like the thing that you're settling on is probably something you've probably maxed out at this point. You've done it so much. But here's the catch. If you've done something a lot very often and you decide to do something different just to try it out, when you go back to that one thing that you're doing a lot, you have gained the experience of the new thing that you have done. And that thing that you've done all the time probably benefits from it. And in fact, it's like a mind trick. It's taking a break from what you're doing. So if you feel like everything's overwhelming and everything varies, take a break from thinking that and do something that you know is always consistent. That's kind of the idea. It's like netted. It's all nested. The personality and stuff is all nested in the way it's described. And it's a chicken or the egg. Like, how do you get out of something if you're already thinking about something? The idea is to lower the hot take here, I suppose, is to lower the barrier enough that you simply end up doing, as opposed to always thinking. And I can definitely tell you, I think a lot, and the hardest thing to do is to get doing. I'm not saying it's easy. It's really difficult because when someone says something, I can't help but think about a lot of things. But eventually you have to do something, which is tough. And the longer you spend just thinking about doing something and not doing anything, the harder it's going to get, in my opinion. It's a fun thing. This all creates a dissonance in my mind because this thing I'm writing focuses on case study and emphasizes the unique things about situations. So all my thoughts right now are by default. I see your point. It's just a little difficult to... Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah. Just a thought. I was completing the digression because I thought to myself, I was trying to keep on task today, but nah, this is worth it. This is a juicy bit. Like, the whole trying to overcome dissonance and focus is like the bane of my life. Like, I have terrible sustained attention, and it's remarkable how much I can convince someone that I have good sustained attention, but really, to me, I pay attention no longer than 30 minutes. This conversation we're having right now, I'm having a new thought like maybe every 15 minutes. Like I'm a terrible sustained attention person, and I always thought I had good attention span, like really good attention span, to the point where I performed worse over the years. The more things I had to remember for an exam, the more I had to prepare, the worse it got. And it came down to the point where I realized I'm just getting diminished return when I keep trying harder. It's pretty good now. I'd say I can probably focus on a single task for maybe 30 minutes, 30 to 40 minutes. You might not think that's a lot, but you can get a lot of things done if you become more efficient with those 30 to 40 minutes. So my 30, 40 minutes might not be the same as someone else's 30, 40 minutes, but it certainly is enough to keep me on task. So every 30 to 40 minutes, I'm allowing a new thought. So for this, I'm switching to a relatable topic every 30 or 40 minutes. So if you ever hear me digress and go back to my digressions, if there were 2 hours, right, a 2-hour digression, I will have at least changed the topic a little bit every 4 or 5 times. Like every 30 minutes, there's going to be a new example or a new thought linked to the previous thought. I wouldn't be like saying, oh, I hate this game, and then I continue to say I hate this game for like an hour, it would not happen. It would be like after 30 minutes, I would talk about what I like about the game, and then maybe another 30 minutes I would talk about what the devs think about the game. It would keep changing every 30 minutes, but it would be somewhat relevant to the whole topic. And then after maybe an hour or two, I would go back to the first topic. And that's how I seem like I'm staying on task. But I cannot focus on one thing. It's actually incredibly impressive to me when I see lecturers and those who give speeches and stuff stay on task. Like, they can talk circles around a singular topic without deviating from it. Do you think there is value in seeing the obstacles, like those you describe experiencing as a neurological condition? Like, a lot of people are talking about ADHD. I do. I explored that quite a bit. Ultimately, I view it more of utilizing it. So, for example, it's not an obstacle. It's just something that I can use appropriately. So if I know I'm losing my attention every 30 minutes, well, how can I frame everything in 30-minute periods? I could try the thing that most people do, which is my attention span is only 30 minutes. How do I make it 35 minutes? Try harder. How do you try harder? So you could say, I'll just try really hard. It's like, that doesn't tell me anything. Like, what do you mean by try very hard? How do you evaluate that? And that's where learning about experiences, neurological conditions help. It helps you say like, well, okay, they know about this thing. So how do I do that? Because there are things I can't put into words, right? And you've described that your mind, it's difficult to describe what's going on, right? The effective. So learning about these things help, but I don't necessarily think of them as obstacles. They're more they're more opportunities to maximize myself. So learning that I have an attention deficit is how I overcome or utilize or combat or like find out what I can do. So here's the GOAT, right? I've always emphasized the importance of a support system and that you're not one person. Like when you try to do tasks, you're not just limited to your one self. So if someone told me, I mean, if a psychologist, I haven't visited a psychologist to really figure it out, to find out. Say they tell me I have ADHD. Well, guess what? That means that I have certain things that I know about my attention span. That's great. How can I solve that problem? Well, it doesn't have to be from me, right? There's technology, there's friends, there's organizations. There are a lot of things even outside yourself. Call it like an augmentation. So I love to read what maybe limits me, or like someone is telling me my limits. So how do I go beyond my limits? I get backup. If you're limited, then recruit something. You're not in this fight alone. I mean, this is gonna sound so sappy, but like a dragon, like this game that centers around slice of life outside of the MSQ, highlights that you are not a one-man army. I would love to wish people to be one-man armies, and including myself. I would love to have the opportunity to be a one-man army. But whenever I see an obstacle, it's information. So when you get information, you learn how to turn the tables, right? The more information you get, it's an opportunity, not an excuse. I think that is like worth everyone. I would wish everyone to see that somehow and feel it at the same time, but it's not the case. It is definitely not the case for the vast majority of people. When they look at when they look at neurological conditions, or they look at people describing their feelings, they're looking for excuses, limitations, things to avoid, things to not work on, or ways to feel better about themselves because they don't have to be as hard on themselves. And that's fair. That's why they're like, that is emotionally protective. But for me, when I see something like, hey, your attention span is not going to get so much better than 30 minutes, it's like, well, what can I do about it? Well, I'll have a phone take care of that, or I'll use more tools. I'll get the tools that I require to keep me on task when I'm not on task. So my phone does things that I can't do as a human being. Sure, like, I'm limited as a human being in this case. But hey, I've a part of my skill is to be able to use technology to change that. It's And I'm saying this as a very humble thing. It's kind of like having a prosthetic. But I'm not saying that from personal experience. Like, feeling like embracing the limitations if you lost your arm, right? If you lost your arm and you just decide, well, biology has told me that 2 arms are probably better than 1, right? So I might as well embrace it. So now you're going to go around and say, sorry, buddy, I only have 1 arm. I can't really juggle 2 things. But then you think like, wait, I only have 1 arm. So I have a spare. Where do I get a second arm from? And that's the idea. You take your information that you have. What can you do about it? And those are the most inspirational stories on YouTube, in my opinion. Like, I'm a sap for these things. Like a guy who plays, I don't know, a guy who like is top 100, pick your favorite battle royale game, using only his feet, or a person who's finally getting a chance to play a video game because they decided, hey, there are people who can get my brain to play the video game for me. Like, like using my brain only instead of my arms, or things like that. And that's what is incredibly strong. And I believe, and this is sappy sorry, this is going to be like a really sappy anime trope thing. But I do believe with a proper mindset that humans can make their happiness happen. Even against like some of the worst possible things. I mean, outside death. I understand death is kind of a one-way street. But we're talking about when you're really sleep deprived, even against the most sleep deprived and dire things, perseverance is an incredible characteristic of humans. And with the proper mindset, things don't feel like obstacles anymore. They just feel like, I'm going to use the C word, challenges, but they're challenges you decide to take. And the more challenges that you can convert from the passive challenge category to the active challenge category, it means you can beat it. It's kind of like that one guy who said, I wouldn't chase after a dream if I know I lose. So they always chase the dream knowing that they can win. It doesn't have to be true. It doesn't have to be reality, which is the whole idea. Like, it depends, like all these things. It's in that moment. There's a distinct possibility you're going to win. And that's like kind of one of the mantras of this game. Like a Dragon is one of the mantras. Kiryu said this literally. So there's still a chance. That was his like whole baseball arc in Yakuza 6, coincidentally. So there's still a chance of winning. That's all that matters at the moment. When you complete the task, right? Like, oh no, you lost. Like, and then you reflect, it's like, oh yeah, like it was like 99.9% to 1 that you would lose, right? And then you realize that after the fact, it's like, but here's the deal. You did it. That is the experience. Any experience is the goat of human power. If you decided to say, if Kiryu decided, oh, it's the odds are 99-1, we might as well not do it, he'll never change. A human being won't ever change in that perspective. Like, you gain nothing. With one big asterisk, if you choose to replace it with something. But generally speaking, avoidant behavior doesn't replace it with something. They avoided it to protect themselves from learning from that. So there's a difference between substituting. So for example, I can't be the top Osu player. I can't be the top streamer, but I'm replacing it with something. I know that whole like nihilism and all that thing is telling me this is the odds of me being a great something. It's like, well, all right, sure, you got me. I'm not going to do that. But what am I replacing it with? I can't have an attention span of an elephant. What am I replacing it with? I have to think of other strategies to do so. And then that goes all the way back to my personal experience with the whole taking a break, attention span thing. And you might not be one of them. So there is a very high chance that, there's a very likelihood that whatever your mindset and stuff is going in your life, it might not work, whatever I'm saying. That's why I make no guarantees. But you will never know if you choose to not do something because you have too many things to juggle, like too many things to worry about. So that's kind of the idea. Is it worth it or is it not? You have to answer that question. For me, all the stuff I said after goes back to why I stand behind the idea of attention span. There are people in this world that I've met so many times in my life over the years. They keep telling me like, boy, I would do so much better if I had an attention span like you, right? And my thought immediately is like, I'm pretty sure statistically you probably have a longer attention span than I do. Like, especially when we were younger, like a 16-year-old come up and say, how do you, have the attention span to go and get a PhD? It's like, well, funny story. I probably don't have the attention span that you think you need to have a PhD, to get a PhD. Or like, how do you stay dedicated to education for 12 years on PhD? Well, the answer is I don't. Like, I didn't do the same thing for 12 years. Like, it's not one thing. You're not doing the same old for 12 years. You're a summation of a lot of things. Like, I slept more than I did studying science over those 12 years. Actually, arguably, there are some periods where I actually did science longer than I slept. But there are ups and downs. But across the 12 years, I didn't just do science for my PhD. I slept, I ate, I socialized, I played video games. So that's kind of the thing. There's a lot, but it can stop you from doing it if you think of it as a lot. So when a kid comes up and says, oh, how do you spend 12 years doing one thing? That's a lot of dedication. They're lumping it together because it's due inexperience, right? Alternatively, you could say, that's dedicated. What did you do during those 12 years? Like, that would fill in what you don't know, right? It's like, it's great. Like, you can feel good for something without giving the impression that you're lumping things together. Because what that does sometimes is it makes... Okay, but there is a two-person problem. It can deflate the accomplishment of someone else, but at the same time, it makes what you want to do more achievable. So like, if for me, it's okay. For others, maybe not so much, but I'm only speaking now personally about myself. If someone says, oh, PhD is not that hard, like you do this and this and this, that strikes me as someone who knows how to partition and understand the moving parts in getting a PhD because they feel more comfortable about it. They sometimes it might be a oversimplification or something, but it would mean that this person is likely to be able to do it. A person that says, "Oh man, I could never do that," it's likely viewing the PhD as a whole thing, like this gigantic one wall leap that they can never make, instead of viewing it as staircases or like a slope up. And that goes with it's a balance between the two mindsets. I will leap, I will picture something as high as I can leap, no more, no less. And if that thing is truly higher than I can leap, I'll break it down into smaller leaps to get to the same height. It'll take me longer, or maybe less, who knows? But whatever it is, I tend to try to view everything in the span that I can appreciate and be able to do. So now, going back to this, it's like, there was a time in my life that I thought there was no way I would be welcoming to streaming or entertaining. Like, here's one last thing just to illustrate. Socializing. Imagine a 16-year-old me who feels like all I can do is pay attention for like 15 minutes. How the heck are you going to have a conversation with someone at a party that lasts 2 hours if your attention span is only 15 minutes? Like, how do you do that? Well, you could be like me, like a little kid who said like, nah, I just won't go to parties. Like, I won't talk to anyone. Like, because I've already accepted that social butterflies can talk to each other for like 2 hours non-stop and never run out of things to say, right? Like, then social anxiety builds, awkwardness, isolation, and then lots and lots of stress. So you're now what do? You go into a cycle of nihilism, basically. You start looking for all the factors that convince yourself that I need a very special type of situation to be less socially awkward. So hopefully, if I get lucky, I'll join a chat room with 30 other people who have an attention span of 15 minutes and don't like to say anything and all feel anxious and stuff. What are the chances that's going to happen? Well, it got better with the internet. That's just an asterisk, though. But when I was 16, the internet is not what we experience. Like, it's barely a thing, right? So, what I did was, generally speaking, said, well, how do I convert 15 into contiguous segments? And then the idea is also, well, how do I even know if I pause and sit there and be awkward for 15 minutes, if that even bothers anyone? You don't know that. You could read a lot about it and say, yeah, sure, like, people don't like, say, well, but you won't know for sure. What I mean is, yes, the odds are against you, but the idea is you're balancing knowing what the reality is and being able to gain experience. And the goat about that is that 15 turn into strategies that I can work with. Because no matter how much you know about something, you can't know about all the obstacles, all the little things without doing it. The whole overwhelming feeling that you have about considering all the factors, it is what's limiting your growth. And also, you lose all that because you haven't done it. So, for example, the first thing I did was, like, some of the first times is I went in there. I was, in fact, socially awkward, unable to keep a conversation for 15 minutes. Felt really horrible. Felt like I wasted my time. I never want to go back. With all that, hyper focused, because I'm an emotional train wreck as a little kid, right? Just, and everyone's garbage, and I know more than everyone else, because I was an arrogant little kid who really didn't know much better. And then in that experiment, I learned some of the things I've observed. Like, oh, why was it 15 minutes? And some of those people actually liked something about me. So now, instead of only coming back with negative things, I also came back with other things that I can't possibly see myself, which is everyone else that you interacted with. So they became the sources of solutions, inspiration, critique when they don't even know about it. So, like, for example, if I went there and someone says, like, 6 of the 8 people said they dislike me, that's information I wouldn't know. No matter how much you are good about it, like, no matter how much you plan and stuff, you can't possibly know that those are the 6 people that hate you. And on top of that, nowadays, I don't even feel like I can be like that. When someone hates me, it's more interesting than when someone likes me. Because when someone likes me, it's usually about the things I already know. When someone challenges me and hates me, that's when I ask them, can you explain that? Because that is the opportunities. Those are the learning experiences now. So to the point where that 15 minutes, it didn't matter anymore. Like, it's just superficial. Like, 15 minutes, well, if you have 8 people, the topic probably changes way more rapidly than 15 minutes. And I can choose who I pay attention to all the time. And if someone yells at me and says, hey, you didn't pay attention to me, it's like, can you explain that to me? Like, I need to know. How long do you pay attention to? And then soon enough, the person who hates me would end up hating me less, or maybe we become friends, because then they would explain the same thing. And turns out, usually, here's the silver lining in most things, that person is probably experiencing something similar. And the reason why they hate you is because they probably know about the behavior that you have. Often, the people who don't care about you, the people who aren't, it's kind of humorous in this sense. When you're thinking about social anxiety, right? And you feel like people don't care about you, the only people that don't care about you are the people that you wouldn't ever talk to in the first place, or they never wouldn't ever talk to you. They might not even be there. So the people who hate you and the people who like you are the people who care enough to even waste emotional energy. Waste, I'll use a different word. Invest emotional energy in you. So yeah, turn that here's the incredible goat at the end. Turn that anxiety into fuel. Turn that stress into fuel. Turn your sleep deprivation as a motivation to remove sleep deprivation. And it's so hard to do. That's the bottom line. It is really hard to do. So in no way am I saying all this stuff, saying, yeah, no, you can be a new man tomorrow. You can be a new person tomorrow. It's just the idea that I wouldn't ever underestimate someone's mindset to be able to make really hard things be manageable. And often I do find myself in reality, like the real truth. I don't have that great amount of, this might be, there is a slight chance I'm being an imposter here, like an imposter syndrome. I don't really know, because an expert would have to tell me, but I'm not downplaying anything. I truly think that the resources that I think people think I have, it's through practice. It's a practice skill. I don't ever think that I was born with resources that are any more remarkable than the next person. And that's the best part, I think. To me, being able to say that means that other people can do it. And that's great. I think that's I think my favorite thing about myself is I am so average that I feel confident enough to tell other people that you can probably do this and be happy with being average, or being happy with limitations. And there's a big asterisk. I don't have a developmental disorder. I don't have I don't know, a terminal illness, or I don't have physical limitations per se. Like, what I mean is crippling disease and disorder, like genetic disorders. But you have to keep in mind, I, as much as it sucks to be one of those people, it is incredibly in the minority. Like, the chances is incredibly small to find that relatable. And those people kind of, cluster together too. And it sucks that they have to do that. And in fact, it's one of the reasons why I wanted to do science, especially genetic diseases and heritable diseases, is because they got so unlucky. Like, it's the lottery of unlucky when you grow up with truly developmental disorders and like stuff. So for me, like saying I have a short attention span, it's like, well, what if I can't even express what I'm thinking? That's like the worst of it. But at the same time, it's like an incredibly small percentage. So whenever you're thinking about stuff that you're struggling with, other people is the key. Like they can be the key, and it's always worth go getting for that. With that said, though, right now that's actually irrelevant to what we're talking about, right? We're talking about self-improvement here. However, self-improvement is linked with interpersonal skills. So taking a chance at that is always worth it. That's my personal bias. I still can't like focus on things really, really terribly. Like every time I get into an exam room, this is gonna be the last thing. Every time I get to an exam room, my first thought is, what tiny sound is gonna happen in that room that's gonna get me to perform worse? That's just it. Like when I sleep in another place, right? You can hear like the tiny clanking of pipes or something, and that would just keep me up all night. In an exam, when someone like constantly shuffles like their shoes or something on the desk, that would probably take me out of it every 15 minutes. So every time, every like 15 or 30 minutes, I would lose time. I would lose attention to do the task. So I had to figure out a way to work around that. So I need to come up with a ritual that gets me back on task every time I get distracted. And it still doesn't work that great. I mean, in graduate school, the first 2 years, we still had exams, right? We still had to take those exams. And it was still a nightmare. Like, in fact, it was even worse because the stuff that you had to write were a lot longer. And it was so difficult to say, oh yeah, I can bust out the answer in 20 minutes. If I could, that would have been great. And one way to do that is just study harder or something. Like, work at it harder. That's fair. That's the brute force method. What I tried to do was come up with like, okay, my sentences are kind of unrelated now. So I stop and move on to the next question. And then I come back. So I started skipping around constantly in the questions, just constantly going back and forth in order to stop myself from getting distracted by something else irrelevant. It's still not the greatest, and I didn't perform really well. So like it's still, graduate school was when I knew I had limitations. I couldn't just get away with being efficient enough to get everything done in like 15-minute and 20-minute intervals. So I had to adapt. Ultimately, the problem kind of solved itself in a way, because then after the 2 years, we stopped taking exams. Like there weren't the like written exam stuff. A lot of it was oral. So when you're doing oral, it's like an entirely different perspective. So ideally, what happened was the career I chose kind of took advantage of my current situation most of the time. And then the other stuff, well, I still worked on it, but I didn't work on it very often. So if I go back into an exam room again, where I'm writing stuff, it's probably gonna be pretty bad. Like it's gonna be a pretty bad experience. I mean, I could already see it in playing video games. Like when I'm, I don't know, trying to complete a boss and it takes longer than 30 minutes of trying, like solid trying, it's gone. Like after 30 minutes, it's like I'm getting worse. I will progressively dip and get worse. So the idea is just to take a break from it. But if I was doing an exam, you don't get to come back. You can't quit and come back. Now, if that was the case, I would totally take up with it. Like, instead of taking, that's why quizzes and stuff work out just fine. That's where all the grades come from. That's where I boost my grades and set up for a mediocre exam performance. In fact, very last story, there was one time, and I absolutely, this is what made me absolutely positive that one person's action in your life can shape a person's entire path. It sounds so sappy, but my advisor and my advisor slash professor slash academic counselor, like basically, there was one time I had an exam and I was freaking out. I was like freaking the heck out. I had so many distracting thoughts. And this exam was just like all open-ended and it took a really long time. And in that day, there was so many things happening. Like someone was sniffling, I was having allergies, and like someone was constantly coughing, and it was insane. But this person, who I mentioned quite a lot, just removed the time limit. He basically said, okay, if anyone needs more time, just come along with me, and the exam turned out fine. But instead of, it was in an environment where it wouldn't be construed as, oh, that's unfair or that's not fair. It was offered to everyone, right? But the idea is, I spent 4 to 5 times longer than the average person in the room to get the same, to get a great result, but it's still a similar result to someone who only spent an hour. I think it might have been like 50 minutes. It was like a 50-minute exam, and I ended up spending 4 hours. It's because I spent like 3 hours being distracted. Like, effectively, that's what you're normalizing to. And you could say, oh, that's because I suck, or like, that's my obstacle, or whatnot. It's like, but what did I get from those 3 extra hours? I finally came to realize that I had something that was different. So I learned from that experience. But that person, that instructor who I feel like I owe so much to professionally, he offered it. He offered that opportunity. So it was him that allowed me the opportunity to know where I am. He could have just said, and your tests in, your 50 minutes are up, hand your tests in, right? You could also, I could have said, no, I want to be like the other people, and just, it's like, I can't think anymore. This is the best I can do, and hand my exam in. So 2 things had to happen that day. Me to take a chance, because it's not just because I'm losing attention and like I didn't prep enough and accept that I suck at paying attention or something. And 2, someone else offered an alternative solution. And it can't happen with just one person. A lot of times it just doesn't happen with one person. Still not irrelevant to that self-help thing. But it was just I say it all the time because it was that moment that it really did change my, actually this person in general, including my best friends that I know now to this date. That period of my life was the first time it wasn't just me. I didn't learn just because I can learn something. I learned because I took risk in interacting with other people. And then now video games is kind of like that. Only I see all the little youngins doing the exact opposite, which is fine because that's how young people learn. Like that's how I did it. Like when I was a kid, that's what you do. You stream based on what you can achieve, what you can do, what you want to tell about yourself, and you're specifically learning because you want to learn. I stream for a very different reason because I don't need to learn about myself very much anymore. I want to learn how to teach other people. I want to learn how to describe to other people what I'm thinking because it's not something that I can control. Like, and it's the last frontier. So when you become comfortable with all the noise of doing things, right? Like, oh, there's so much variability in this. Human perception and stuff is very complicated. When you become comfortable with saying, I think I know enough that I'm going to take a chance, it translates to other things being not as difficult too. Like your perception changes. It's like, well, I don't want to talk to this guy. This guy seems like they hate me and all that stuff. And then I can read into this and it's like, well, I do that knowing all that as well. So like the threshold keeps going up. Like I could say, I know 90% sure that this person dislikes Like a Dragon games. I'm not going to talk to this person. No. In fact, I literally want to do it to see if I'm correct. And if I'm wrong, that's even more interesting. So no longer is it that the more you know, the more technical you are, the more nihilistic you become. I don't become more nihilistic. I become more a go-getter. So because what you just said about it depends on a lot of things, that's the reason why I want to do it. As opposed to becoming the reason not to do it. Like, is this the best way to learn how to play this game? It's like, what is the best way to level up? Like, well, there's a lot of factors in that. It's like, you know what? I don't really want to do this because I need to know what the best way to do this. For me, it's like, I don't know what the best way is. Let's just do it because it doesn't matter. Like, I want to do it and see what my best way is because the best way isn't the best way. It's my way. And that's kind of the way it goes. And then when I do it a certain way, like how I'm streaming right now and digressing really hard on while trying to complete Yakuza 5, how are you going to do it? And because I did it this way, incredibly inefficiently, or to some people, I want to see what an efficient person would. Like I want to go on YouTube now and see what do people talk about when they're playing Like a Dragon. What does it get people to talk about? And of course, it does confirm a lot of my suspicions, which is less interesting, but still, it's information. Like most people talk about the combat a lot of times, like how it makes them emotionally. They care a lot about it. They love to hate that stuff, like the combat, over and over again. And then they sideline, the sub stories. Like rarely can I even find material in which people connect all the sub stories together and whatnot and all that. And then people like the music, which I do too. But that's the idea. It varies so much that is the perfect time to try to do it. In fact, what I'm telling you now, I guess, if you're not, if you're still holding on to, I want you to prove to me that it doesn't work for you. That would be so interesting. Like, I'm not telling you something to guarantee that it's better or worse. I want you to share with me what your results are. That's kind of the idea. Like, it's not, I can't tell you what's going to happen. I'm offering you a choice, and then you can choose to do it or not. And that's kind of the best part about interacting with another person. That person is an endless source outside yourself. And the more people you surround yourself with that can do that, the better. Of course, like the downside is if you're not a person who's reached my state of mind where you're more encouraged to do things when a lot of information is thrown at you, that could make you really depressed, and that's definitely not the target audience. So if you get too hung up on oh no, 6 people told me 6 different things and now I have to somehow incorporate all 6 things into one solution, that's probably where that falls apart, where like more people is beneficial. But for me, that's where it's at. All right, that's a good digression point that we'll hold on to. But I am kind of curious about what your assignment is about. But that might be another topic for another time. All right, I was gonna stop here actually. So this was where I was gonna end. So we were gonna switch we're gonna switch to Yakuza 6 for like 2 or 3 hours. So we're gonna move on to Yakuza 6. So we're switching gears.